October 18, 1944. Berlin. Isef Goebbels stood at a microphone and told Germany it was saved. His articulation was sharp, certain. He batten of 16 actor men ascent, as one anatomy to avert the Reich. He batten of age-old Germanic warriors who had hurled aback Roman legions from these aforementioned forests and rivers centuries before. He told the German bodies that the adversary at the gates was not a assurance of collapse. It was the moment for the final triumph. He alleged it the Volkssturm or the People's Storm. The radio agitated his words to every bend of what remained of Hitler's Germany. A fair admiral in amber uniforms listened and applauded. Some wept. A few believed every word. In a quiet apple about in Silesia, a man in his 50s bankrupted the bi-weekly and set it on the kitchen table. In a baby boondocks in East Prussia, an old woman afraid laundry in the autumn cold. In Berlin, and a boy of 13 kicked a bean-bottom or to Clay Alley and had no absorption that his name was already on a list. Goebbels did not acknowledgement what had fabricated this moment necessary. He did not acknowledgement that the Wehrmacht, Germany's able army, was actuality arena to pieces on two fronts. He did not acknowledgement that the Soviets had above into German age captivated Poland and were closing fast. He did not acknowledgement that American and British armament had burst out of Normandy and were antagonism adjoined the Rhine. And he did not acknowledgement that the Luftwaffe about existed anymore, that German catch basin assembly had been devastated by Allied bombing, that armament was about gone and armament was active short. The Volkssturm was not built in from strength, it was built in from desperation, dressed up to attending like strength, and the men who would ample its ranks had no absorption what was advancing for them. To accept what happened next, it helps to accept what Adolf Hitler believed about the attributes of war. And he believed acutely, and afterwards catechism, that what was added important than material. That a man who absolutely believed in his account could outfight a man who did not. No bulk the odds. He had accounting this in abundance camp. He had again it to his generals for years, and in the aboriginal years of the war, it had seemed to work, or at atomic it had seemed to assignment connected abundant for the acceptance to amalgamate into article unchallengeable. By backward 1944, his generals knew better, and they had watched their panzer capacity bulwark to arrest in Soviet mud. They had watched their infantry benumb al fresco Moscow, al fresco Leningrad, al fresco Stalingrad. They had watched 300,000 men abandonment at Stalingrad alone. Not because those men lacked will, but because they ran out of food, ammunition, and reinforcement. Hitler's acknowledgement to every one of these disasters was consistently the same. The commanders lacked faith. The men lacked fanaticism. The Band-Aid was consistently added credo, and not bigger logistics. The Volkssturm was that celebration taken to its final acute conclusion. The decree Hitler active on September 25, 1944 placed the Volk not beneath the Wehrmacht Germany's aggressive, but beneath the Nazi affair itself. Heinrich Himmler, arch of the SS, and one of the architects of the Holocaust, was alleged its commander. The bounded Nazi affair bosses, the Gauters, were amenable for raising, equipping, and deploying units in their districts. And this detail mattered added than about annihilation else. By putting the Volkssturm in affair easily instead of aggressive hands, Hitler was sending his generals a message. He didn't assurance them. He was cogent his army that these new armament answered to ideology, not to able command. General Heinz Guderian, one of Germany's best admired catch basin commanders, and by backward 1944 the army arch of agents, declared the Volkssturm decree as a cardboarded measurement that could accept little after effect on the war's outcome. He was actuality affable who was actuality alleged up. The decree covered all German males amid 16 and 60 who were not already in the aggressive or capital war production. In practice, it was generally added than that. Boys as adolescent as 12 were recruited, sometimes by their own Hitler adolescence leaders who handed them weapons afore they had any time shaved. Men in their mid-60s, armed with bad knees and anemic hearts, begin acceptance notices slipped beneath their doors. A academy abecedary in Breslau, a chef in Königsberg, a retired postal artisan in East Prussia, a 15-year-old in Berlin whose earlier brothers were already asleep in Russia. Their training lasted in best cases amid 1 and 4 weeks. Some accustomed beneath than that. Their primary weapon was the Panzerfaust, a single-shot disposable anti-tank rocket launcher. It was bargained to make, simple, abundant to explain, or wasn't absolutely baleful to join tanks at a budding range. The botheration was what a budding ambit meant. To hit a Soviet T-34 catch basin with a Panzerfaust, a man had to be oral 30 m of it. 30 m, about the breadth of 3 Berghaus buses anchored end to end. No bulk of credo makes 30 m feel like a safe ambit from an effective tank. January 12, 1945. The Soviets launched the Vistula Oder offensive. It was one of the better aggressive operations in the history of warfare. In Marshal Georgy Zhukov and Marshal Ivan KV Beatific 2.2 actor soldiers surging westward 4th A advanced edition, hundreds of miles. They had 6,464 tanks. They had 46,000 arms pieces. So abounding accoutrements arranged calm that their aperture battery befuddled the arena for 2 hours afterwards. Pause. Adjoin this. The association waited in agilely dug trenches and cellars of baffed barricades fabricated from chaotic trams. Some units had beneath than 50 rifles for 100 men, but they were told to aces up weapons from the fallen. The aboriginal folk units to see austere action did so in East Prussia, one of the best barbarous theaters of the war's final months. East Prussia was home to about 2.5 actor German civilians. It had been allotment of Germany for centuries. The bodies there had abysmal roots in that soil. A back Soviet armament approached, a bounding band to accept the crisis until it was far too late. The Gauleiter of East Prussia was a man alleged Erich Kau, and he was one of the best aboriginal Nazi administrators in the active East. A man who had spent years administering atrocities in Ukraine. Now, as Soviet armies bore bottomward on his own territory, he delayed non-combatant aborticide orders for weeks, partly from stubbornness, partly from the acceptance in the allegory he had helped create. The German would ascendancy the line. The Volker units co-deployed were accustomed no algid acclimate action clothing. Abounding had no able boots. They accustomed their panzer and were a secular East. The Soviets did not apathetic down. There were moments of 18-karat courage. History demands that be said clearly. In October 1944, Soviet armament briefly bankrupt through the advanced in East Prussia and committed atrocities adjoined German civilians in the Apple of Nemesisdorf. A back German armament retook the village. What they began was acclimated as advertising above the Reich. But for folk men active in the East, and arresting their homes was not an abstraction. Their wives were in those villages, their children. Some of those men fought with the atrocity that afraid akin accomplished Soviet soldiers. But courage, akin fierce, atrocious courage, cannot ascendancy affront. And the advance did not hold. Soviet Admiral Celebratory captured Fokker men beatific aback belletrist that alloyed antipathy with article after peace to pity. The one Soviet administrator declared capturing what his intelligence had listed as a German arresting position and award instead 9 men. The youngest looked about 15. The oldest was at atomic 60. Amid them, they had 2 animate rifles, 1 Panzerfaust, and no communications equipment. They had been ordered to ascendancy a road. They had been there for 4 days. They had eaten annihilation in the aftermost too. Their administrator was a bounded academy abecetery who had never accursed a weapon afore September 1944. The Soviet administrator acclaimed all of this in his report. Then he acclaimed article he began striking. Several of the men had not run. They had backward at their post, not because they believed they could win, but because they had been told their families would face abuse if they deserted. If this adventure affairs to you, booty a additional appropriate now to hit that subscribe button and leave a animate version below. And these are the acceptance that deserve to be remembered. And your abutment is what makes it accessible to accumulate cogent them. February 1945, the Berghaus of Brlo. Brlo, today the Polish Berghaus of Wrocław, was belted by Soviet armament and declared a breastwork Berghaus by Hitler. It would be dedicated to the last. The Folkum fabricated up an ample allocation of its garrison. The Annoy lasted from February 13th to May 6th, 1945. 3 months by the time it concluded, and about 170,000 civilians were trapped central the city. The Berghaus was systematically burst block by block. Volkssturm men were ordered to bride a landing band in the average of Breslau by physically disturbing bottomward absolute Berghaus blocks with their easily, while Soviet arms connected to fall. Bags of them died accomplishing this, not angry the enemy, accomplishing architecture assignment beneath fire. The Geyer of Berlin, Karl Hanke, Nas ordered the beheading of any man who showed any assurance of abandonment or retreat. Men were hanged from lampposts with signs placed about their necks that read, "I was too afraid to action for my homeland." Some of those accomplished had in actuality been angry for weeks. They were asleep for beat afterwards orders during a Soviet assault. This was a back the chat annihilation began actualization in German aggressive communications, not in Soviet dispatches, in German ones. General Guderian, and in both his wartime account and his post-war account wrote, with about active acerbity about the way Volkssturm units were deployed in the field. He declared watching green men and boys beatific adjoin Soviet armor with no armed support, no armor of their own, no retreat routes, no astute plan. He wrote that the deployment of the Volkssturm as it was absolutely conducted was, and he acclamated the German chat directly, Mord, murder. He was not abandoned in that judgment. General Goddard Henrietzi, who was accustomed command of German armament arresting Berlin in April 1945, was apparent the Volkssturm units he was accepted to arrange as allotment of the defense. He surveyed the men, elderly, young, abominably equipped, some cutting non-combatant coats with abandoned an armband to mark them as soldiers. He angry to his agents and said words that were recorded in assorted abstracted accounts by men who were present. With these men, I'm declared to ascendancy Berlin. It is not possible. It has never been possible. April 16, 1945, the Soviets launched their final beforehand on Berlin. Zhukov's armament above the Oder River. 3 weeks later, the war in Europe would be over. But those 3 weeks amount in astronomic appraisal and lives on both abandoned and best heavily amid the German civilians and Volkssturm troops bent in the collapse. In Berlin alone, estimates abode the cardinal of Volkssturm associates asleep in the final aegis of the Berghaus at amid 22,000 and 25,000. Now, these abstracts are estimated because abounding died in means that were never formally recorded. Shot in artery fighting, accomplished by SS units for retreating, active beneath rubble, listed artlessly as missing. Boys of 13 and 14 were begin asleep in the accident of the Berghaus with Panzerass still in their hands. Men in their backward 50s were begin in burst cellars, still cutting their armbands. They had been told this was the absolute moment, that they were the absorber of the German people, and that history would bethink their stand. Best of them had. No illusions larboard by the time they died. They knew the war was lost. Some had accepted it for months. They fought anyhow because they were ordered to, because their families were abutting by, because abrogation meant a rope. May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered. The final accounting of the Volkssturm is difficult to account with attention because so abounding annal were destroyed in the anarchy of the collapse. But historians animate from absolute documents, Soviet archives, and post-war testimonies accept accustomed at estimates that are sobering, akin by the standards of a war that had already produced casualties on a calibration about above comprehension. About amid 175,000 and 200,000 Volkssturm associates were asleep amid October 1944 and May 1945. Some estimates run higher. The blood-soaked and captured added hundreds of bags more. Abounding of those taken captive by the Soviets spent years in activity camps afore abiding home, if they alternate at all. In barter for all of this, the Volkssturm accomplished annihilation of cardinal value. Not one above Soviet beforehand was apoplectic by Volkssturm attrition alone. Not one action was antipodal by their presence. The cities declared fortresses Berlin, Königsberg, Poznan fell. Anyway, the aegis of Berlin delayed the Soviet activity by canicule at most. Karl Dönitz, that who briefly led Germany afterwards Hitler's suicide on April 30th afterwards wrote that the Volkssturm was never advised to win battles. It was advised to authenticate to the German bodies and to the watching apple that Germany would action to the aftermost man. It was he accepted a political action fabricated with animal lives. Heinrich Himmler, who allowable the Volkssturm and acclimated it partly to extend SS ascendancy over the aftermost activity structures of German association, was captured in May 1945 and swallowed a cyanide abridged afore he could face a tribunal. Joseph Goebbels, who had appeared the Volkssturm with such affected authoritativeness on that October afternoon in 1944, died in the Berlin Olympic on May 1, 1945, One day afterwards his wife berserked their six accouchement, so they would not accept to animate in a apple afterwards civic socialism. The men who congenital the folk did not outlive it by long. In the years afterwards the war, the German aggressive commanders who had survived sat bottomward with historians and journalists and tribunals and said what they had not been acceptable to say while Hitler was alive. The accord was about uniform. General Alfred Jodl, Hitler's arch of operations, had watched Volkssturm units deployed above the eastern advance in the war's final months. His clandestine affidavit recovered afterwards his beheading at Nuremberg appearance a man who accustomed the futility but acquainted trapped. And he wrote that sending the Volkssturm join the Red Army in aboriginal 1945 was like captivation up a duke to stop a calamity river. General Erich von Stein autograph in his account afterwards the war declared the folk as a evidence of a added the backup of aggressive acumen with political will. He had watched Hitler override his generals for years substituting brainy authoritativeness for able assessment. The folk was area that arrangement assuredly ran out of road. And the men who absolutely served in folk units, those who came home, gave accounts above the afterward decades that were added claimed and far added raw. Vera Mo was 15 years old aback. He was assigned to a folk assemblage arresting Berlin in April 1945. He was accustomed to pain rust and placed in an apartment on an artery in the Princeau Berg commune of the city. He backward there for 6 days. In an account accustomed years later, he said, "We were terrified, all of us. The earlier men, too, and no one believed we were activity to stop the Russians. We were cat and mouse to die or to surrender, whichever came first. I had a weapon absolutely alert in training. I was a child. We were all aloof children, akin the old ones. Aback it came to that." Hans Ulrich Griffith was 53 years old aback. He accustomed his folk acceptance notice. He was a pharmacist in a baby boondocks in Silesia, and he survived the war by surrendering to Soviet armament in February 1945 and spent 3 years in a captive of war affected in the Urals of 4 abiding to West Germany in 1948. In an account recorded in 1979, he was asked what he anticipation aback that acceptance apprehension arrived. He was quiet for a connected moment. Then he said, "I anticipation their activity to get us all killed. Not for Germany, for him, for the party. Germany was already finished. They were killing us for a corpse." There is a specific affectionate of accident that happens aback men inability abash the achievement of will with the absolute control of it. Germany in backward 1944 had abounding things. It had biased charge at the top of its leadership. It had an advertising apparatus that could dress any adversity in the accent of destiny. It had millions of accustomed bodies who had been told for 12 years that they were allotment of article historic, article chosen, and article congenital to aftermost 1,000 years. What it did not accept by backward 1944 was an army able of captivation, its arena adjoined the armament closing in from east and west. The Wagen did not ample that gap. It could not. No armband and no Panzerfaust changes the mathematics of 2.2 actor Soviet soldiers with 6,000 tanks. What makes the folk audible from added aggressive disasters of the war is not the calibration of the afterlife, admitting the calibration was astronomic, and it is the accurate attributes of the apparition that acquired it. Hitler and the men about him had spent years watching accustomed Germans accomplish amazing sacrifices in account of the Reich. They had fatigued the amiss assignment from it. They believed bodies fought adamantine because they believed in civic socialism. In some cases, at some credibility in the war, that was partly true. But in best cases, bodies fought adamantine because they were well led, because they had no best, and or because the man beside them would die if they stopped. By 1944, best Germans, soldiers, and civilians akin had chock-full believing. The belletrist home from the front, the affidavit recovered afterwards the war, the testimonies accustomed above the afterward decades. They acquaint a constant adventure of a citizenry that knew the war was absent and was waiting, acquisitive for addition in ascendancy to accept it. No one in ascendancy accepted it. Instead, they alleged up the grandfathers. The boys who died in Berlin with Panzerfausts in their easily were not bootless soldiers. They were accouchement-handed weapons and a secular at article they could never accept stopped. The men in their 50s who froze in East Prussian trenches were not bootless warriors. They were trades bodies and clerks and agents who had been told that acceptance was armor. Acceptance is not armor. This is the affair the Volkssturm accepted at an amount that should never accept appropriate proving. McGeneral Henrici, the man who stood afore those troops in April 1945 and said captivation Berlin with them was not possible, did what he could. He approved to bottle lives area canning was possible. He pushed back adjoin orders to avert every architecture to the aftermost bullet. He was one of the few chief German commanders who banned to pretend that what was accident was annihilation added than what it was. He was adequate of command on April 28, 1945. 10 Canicule for Germany surrendered for aggravating to save lives. He survived the war. He died in 1971 at the age of 83. The pharmacist from Silesia came home to a country that had adversity attractive at men like him. Volkssturm veterans active and afflictive class in POS.